So context, history, politics, and geography. I started talking a little bit about it when I mentioned the Hapsburgs and Bourbons. This is a map from that exhibition catalog I just mentioned, the show that opened in Philadelphia. This was one of the maps at the front of the catalog that provides some context as to sort of the extent of the Spanish Empire's expansion. I mean, they were also in parts of Africa and parts of Asia, but we're not really seeing that. Mm-hmm.
Do you mind if we take pictures?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, do whatever you want to do. Record, take photos.
Is there a possibility that we will put it on the website?
I can have them do it. Yeah, I don't have any problem with that. Yeah.
Can you tell me again what was the name of the show that was in Philadelphia?
It was The Art of Colonial Latin America, 1520 to 1821. Something along those lines. And again, like those dates, it's supposed to be an exhibition of Latin America, but those are the Mexican dates. So this is still like a structuring framework for a lot of colonial art historians that I take issue with, because those dates do not reflect Peru or what happens in Cuba, which is colonial, way past 1821. So, but that's the title generally, more or less. It might be 1521 to 1820. I can't get it straight. But in any case, so this is one of the maps that kind of gives us a sense of, like I said, the territorial expansion. So Spain's up there. These are the territories, the little orange ones. That's what is settled and claimed by Spain. And then, of course, the Philippines, as far, like they're distant, but they're actually governed by Mexico City. Okay? So just to kind of give you a sense, one of the things that's really astounding to me, or was astounding to me, I guess it still is, when I was learning this material as a student, was how extensively the Spanish were able to explore and settle in a matter of like 40, 50 years. They had settled close to 75% of the Western Hemisphere, starting with the Caribbean and moving throughout what's a big chunk of the US all the way down to South America, and then the Philippines. And one of the reasons that clearly explains how this was, how they were able to accomplish this feat, is that most of the territories that they were exploring, what today is south of the border, were populated by complex native civilizations. So in other words, they didn't arrive into a bare landscape. They arrived into imperial territories that were already populated by huge cities. The natives had highways connecting the different regions of their empires. They had trade networks already set up. The Spanish didn't really create anything new. They plopped themselves onto the pre-existing cities. I think that if these areas had not been populated by complex native cultures, the history of the Spanish would have been very different. But they arrived to a place that had already been developed to some extent. If you look at all the major cities, Cusco, Mexico City, these were already there. These were native cities. The Spanish moved in. What's that?
Manila.
Yeah, Manila was already there. Manila had been a trading post for a very long time. The Spanish Catholics were the last arrivals. The Muslims had been there, Hindus, all these different groups had already been to Manila or to the Philippines. So a lot of these cities, with some exceptions, some cities are brand new that the Spanish built, but the vast majority of the cities that become the primary administrative centers were pre-existing cities already. The Spanish arrived to an already developed territory that had its own governmental structures, its own trade networks, etc. Okay? That's something important to keep in mind. I think that's what facilitated sort of the ease with which the Spanish were able to just cover so much territory, is that they used what was already in place. Okay? What else was I going to say about that? Mm-hmm.
So you've got New Spain.
Yes.
I'm just trying to get in my head the boundaries, because then you...
Oh yeah, I have another map.
Okay.
I think I have another map. I should have another map that kind of delineates the different viceroyalties. I think it's coming up. So the Spanish crown, again, during the colonial viceregal period. So the Austrian Habsburgs arrive on the Spanish throne in 1516, and they ruled through 1700. I'm going to say more about the Habsburgs and Bourbons. Then the French Bourbons come into power 1700 until Mexico until its independence in 1821. There's a general kind of perception that the colonial period is one monolithic chunk. But when you really look closely, it can actually be subdivided in a variety of ways. And this is how I teach my courses. Besides my survey, or Introduction to Colonial Art, I have a course specifically focused on the Habsburg period, and then I have another course specifically focused on the Bourbon period. So I think that in terms of breaking it up into smaller chunks, like the first way to do it is to look at the change on the Spanish throne, because they're really different. The Habsburgs have a very particular way of ruling and governing, of administrating their empire. The Bourbons come into the picture, completely different way of doing things. And these different philosophies and political strategies influence the culture that's produced. We see it reflected in the art. The arts change when the Bourbons come into power. I'm going to talk about that when we get to like cast paintings, of course. But these are the two general kind of political chunks.
Could you just go back to your map?
Sure.
So it goes almost all the way down, but it doesn't go into where we think of as Argentina. It doesn't go that far down in South America.
It's like right here. Part of Argentina's in it.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And then Brazil is left out. and
It's
that is-
Portuguese.
that's
Part of the Portuguese Empire.
I'm just interested because Brazil seems to have been left out.
Yeah, because it's not Spanish. Yeah,
Of the whole
yeah,
thing.
yeah. Unfortunately, it's left out of everything. Yeah, it's not part of the Spanish Empire. It's part of the Portuguese Empire. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because we're talking about the Spanish colonial context, and Brazil falls into a different cultural kind of imperial context. That's part of Portugal. Yeah. What's that? Oh yeah, that's down here. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, just to briefly answer your question, so New Spain, the northernmost port is San Francisco, okay? And it goes all the way down to here. And then this is all Peru. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, there are only two viceroyalties, New Spain and Peru. In the 18th century, when the Bourbons come in, they restructure Peru. So they break Peru up into three parts. This becomes Nueva Granada, this is Peru, and this becomes Rio de la Plata, okay? And that's to govern it more effectively. They want to break it down into more governable chunks. I think I brought a map. I hope I brought the map.
They actually refer to it, we call it Peru, but like, is that?
Yeah, Peru. It was the viceroyalty of Peru.
Where does that word come from?
It's a native word, Peru. Yeah. And so the Spanish Habsburgs, I just noted the names of the major rulers. Maximilian becomes the first like Catholic emperor. Okay, this is 1459, 1519, his life. These are the life dates. His son, Philip I, marries the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Juana, who's the regent of Spain. That's how we see the Habsburgs start to enter the realm of Spanish politics. It's through Philip. It's very convoluted. These royal family lineages, they're fascinating, but they're complicated. But Philip I marries Juana. They have several children. He's supposed to take over from Maximilian, but he dies very young. So his son, Maximilian's grandson, Charles V, accedes to the throne earlier than expected when his father dies. And Charles V is the first sort of king in Spain at the time of the colonial expansion. So the Spanish colonial territories, the viceroyalties, are established during the Habsburg reign. They are the ones that establish the viceregal system in the Americas. So it starts with Charles IV when he arrives at the throne in 1516, all the way until the last Habsburg, who passes away in 1700, Charles II. One of the things I want to say about the Habsburgs, this is an interesting topic when I teach this class for my students, is they were inbred. They practiced consanguinity, that is, cousins married cousins. We see this happen in various royal families. But the Habsburgs, they married relatives. And what ends up happening is that through the years, there's an accumulation of genetic mutations. So what we see, especially with Philip III, IV, and Charles II, is that they have deformities. And it gets so bad that by the time we get to Charles II, he's virtually retarded, he is infertile. The pronounced jaw, becomes a characteristic of this Habsburg mutation. He can't eat. It's painful for him to speak. So he leaves no heirs. When he dies, there's no heir. And this is a very important thing to kind of keep in mind, is that this practice is what destroys an empire. It's what contributes to the termination of a dynasty, this practice. And that's why the Habsburg dynasty ended. It wasn't for any other political reason. It's just that because of this inbreeding and the genetic mutations, that the mutations got so bad that the last emperor had no heirs. And because of this genetic mutation also, their ability to rule was compromised. So the Habsburg Empire was not governed very well towards the end of the 17th century. So when Charles II dies without an heir, we have what's called the War of Succession, where different royal figures vie for the Spanish throne. Everybody wants to get on the Spanish throne to have access to these resources. Spain had no resources of its own. It acquired all of its economic power from the resources it was able to siphon out of its colonial territories. Gold, silver, different types of agricultural products, tax revenue. It got all of its economic sustenance from its colonial territories. So Spain jealously controlled its American territories. No one was allowed to enter its American territories without explicit permission. Okay, but the War of Succession, because of this kind of interest in the American resources, you have various royal figures vying for the Spanish throne. This occurs from around 1700 to about 1715, the War of Succession. And the French king places his grandson, Philip, on the Spanish throne. And from that period, starting in 1700, that's the entry of the French Bourbons into the Spanish political system. I'm going to show you some portraits. I brought some portraits of these individuals, especially with the Habsburgs. You can see how they're becoming deformed over time. So this is Maximilian I, the first Holy Roman Emperor, okay, with his wife and his 3 children, one of whom is going to become king, but then dies young. This is his son, Philip I. He's the one who marries Juana, the daughter of Ferdinand Isabella. She's a very interesting historical figure. She's known as Juana la Loca, Juana the Crazy One. She appears to have had some kind of mental problems, perhaps schizophrenic has been suggested. But she's an interesting figure to read about. But she was the Spanish regent. She marries Philip I. They have children. Philip I dies young. And then his son, Charles IV, takes over. He takes over the Spanish throne. And Charles V is the king at the time of the conquest and the expansion of the rest of the viceregal territories. So it's under his rule that the territories are established as viceroyalties. Okay, he's an able leader. And then these are his successors. Philip II, also known as the Handsome, was a ladies' man. These are really interesting figures. I've been reading a lot about them. His son, Philip III, we begin to see sort of an elongated jaw. Again here, Philip IV. And then the final Habsburg, Charles II.
So Charles IV that comes later, the Goya paints.
Yeah, that's later. That's in the 18th century.
How does that succession thing work? And is there any Habsburg family blood in
Yes.
in that?
Yeah, well, they're intermarried. The Habsburgs and Bourbons intermarry.
Was Maria Luisa de Palma, was she a Habsburg too?
No, she was a Bourbon, but she had Habsburg blood. That they intermarried. So the Bourbons shared some Habsburg blood.
She's not particularly pretty.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Goya comes in a little later with the Bourbons.
But I just
Yeah.
wondered if the line still somehow, even after that
Yeah.
War of Succession,
Sure.
comes back.
Oh, yeah, it's still there.
Okay.
Yeah, the Habsburgs are still there. Actually, the Habsburgs were brought back to Mexico, and this is taking me off topic, but in the 19th century. In the 1860s, after failure of self-governance and infighting, the conservatives in Mexico City bring another Habsburg back to Mexico as its ruler, in the hopes that this connection would bring money into Mexico, and he's around for like 4 years, and then he gets executed, and which is it's a scandal. So the Habsburgs are around; they don't disappear. They're just not on the Spanish throne anymore, but they're still there in other parts of Europe. And then again, they're brought back to Mexico. It's not the Mexicans aren't done with the Habsburgs just yet. They do come back later in the 19th century, but that's a whole other lecture, which I would love to talk about because that's something I'm working on. But
Geography. So
yeah.
when these dynasties come in, when you say the French king put his grandson, is that, I mean, it's still in the name of Spain, right? He's
Yes,
not Spanish,
that's
but
right.
They're under French
Yes.
rule? Okay.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. You say yes or no.
Okay.
During the War of Succession, so there's this power vacuum. Did the natives ever try to rise up and?
No.
No?
No, not at this point. They do rise up a century later when Spain starts to experience some serious political instability. There's the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, that inspire. It's an age of revolution. There's a French Revolution, and this is more in the Bourbon period. The Americans, not just natives, because actually in the 18th century, the natives are pro-crown. It's the American-born Hispanics, the Creoles, that want to remove Spanish control. Actually, the natives want to retain it because at least under the Spanish crown, their lands and their privileges are protected by the Spanish crown. They know that if they lose the protection of the Spanish crown, the local Hispanics, the wealthy elites, are going to take their land, which is what happens. So that's an interesting thing most people would not expect, that the natives are actually pro-crown, many of them, because they feel protected, at least, under the Spanish crown's rule. And they see what's coming. They're like, if the Spanish crown relinquishes control and we're left to our own devices, the local Creoles, the Creole elite, they're going to try to take our lands, and they do. What they feared comes true. But again, that's a little bit later. For War of Succession, the Bourbon monarchy succeeds the Habsburgs and Spanish throne. Other European powers are worried of an alliance between France and Spain. They'll be unstoppable. So there's some compromise. Other European nations agree that they won't stand in the way, but Spain has to relinquish its territories in Europe. The viceroyalties are not the first viceroyalties Spain had. Those models are based on viceroyalties Spain had in Europe. So the Spanish viceroyalties were the Netherlands. They fell under Spanish jurisdiction starting in the 16th century. Then in Italy, Naples, and Milan. These were all Spanish viceroyalties, and these were the models that were then implemented in the Americas. Okay, these viceroyalties that functioned. Okay, they're far away from Spain, but they fall under Spanish jurisdiction, were seen as functional models that could be effective in terms of governing these other distant lands that had been recently added to the Spanish Empire. Mm-hmm. Sure.
History. Aren't the Netherlands free of Spain earlier than 1700?
Yeah, they're a little bit.
So that's not necessarily because of the War of Succession.
Right. Well,
another
yes.
battle.
Yeah.
Who forced them to do this?
Various European nations, other royal families, other royal leaders were concerned that there might be an alliance between France and Spain now that the Bourbons had acceded to the Spanish throne. So they had to do, it's a much more complicated political process, but the main gist is that Spain was coerced into relinquishing its European viceroyalties. Okay, and this is when the Netherlands and Naples and Milan kind of become independent again. I mean, the Netherlands had been fighting against Spanish control the entire time, but it's around this period that they're officially just relinquished. Spain stops trying to control them, they're let go. Mm-hmm. The Bourbon monarchy, it's Philip V. He's a grandson of Charles XIV. He's installed on the Spanish throne following the War of Succession. He steps down 1 year. He's forced down, and it's only for about a year. And then he comes back to the Spanish throne later that same year. So that's why the dates are organized like this. Ferdinand VI, then there's Charles III. When the Bourbons come into power, they inherit a bankrupt empire. Okay, the Habsburgs had a really interesting way of governing their American territories. As long as they got their tribute, they didn't really care what was happening over here. They came into power in the late medieval period, the Renaissance period. So their approach to governing was attached to a feudal social system where you have landed elites and everybody else pays tribute or rent. So it's a feudal system that they implement in the Americas in the 16th century. They have very different ideas. Their economic policies were laissez-faire. It's like, as long as we get our tribute, you're on your own. So what this does is, through the 16th, 17th century, local elites in the Americas accrue a lot of wealth through their participation both in local trade and international trade. That becomes a very important point because the Bourbons come in and mess it all up. So the Habsburgs, as long as they got their tribute, you could do whatever you wanted. Okay? When the Bourbons come in, it's an absolutist monarchy. It's all about centralization. But in any case, so the Bourbons come in, and because of the problems with the final Habsburg monarchs, because of their very kind of loose form of governance and the structure that they implemented, the empire was in trouble. It was bankrupt. There were a lot of elements that were seen as sort of outside of the jurisdiction of the Spanish government. So the Bourbons come in, and they're very critical of the Habsburgs. They want to centralize everything. For the Bourbons, everything's about money. They implement a body of policies known as the Bourbon Reforms. Very important for the 18th century. Bourbon Reforms. Okay? And these policies were meant to reorganize its imperial territories, to better regulate foreign trade, okay, to modernize its imperial cities, specifically in terms of architecture and art, basically to fortify Spain's control over its American territories. They were trying to clean up the mess they felt the Habsburgs had left behind. So they inherited an empire that was in financial straits, that was disorganized from their perspective. And they come in and they reorganize the territories. They implement a different system of governance. And one of the results of the Bourbon reforms is that local American elites see their economic foundation destabilized because they are no longer allowed to participate in foreign trade. The government regulates foreign trade. So where before local merchants could participate in local trade, now they're not allowed to do that. The reforms do a number of things that disrupt what local elites had gotten used to in terms of their economic security and their economic practices. The reforms change gradually sort of the visual fabric of the city, especially when neoclassicism starts to be introduced. You know, the Baroque aesthetic, the Spanish version of the Baroque aesthetic known as the churrigueresco. It's named after a family of architects, Churriguera. Churrigueresco. The Churrigueresque style, Churrigueresco. The Churriguera family is a family of architects in early 18th century Spain. And they developed this like highly ornate, almost Rococo, like a Spanish version of Rococo style that becomes very, very popular in the Americas when it's introduced by the Bourbons. That takes off, it takes root. The Baroque takes root in the Americas, and when it starts to disappear in Europe, it takes on new life over here and becomes something else. You know, this is a very good example of how something that develops in Europe, the Baroque style, it starts to change. Over here it's introduced and it takes root and it becomes something else. It functions differently and means something else to locals. They become invested in this. So then you have the Bourbons coming in and they start introducing neoclassicism. You know, eventually they found the academy. The first art academy in the Americas is founded by the Bourbons. The Academy of San Carlos was founded in 1781. And one of the main functions of the academy is to erase the Baroque from the city. Baroque churches, Baroque altarpieces are destroyed and replaced with neoclassical altarpieces and facades. This angers the local population. Everything the Bourbons do upsets the local population. So the harder, this is what's ironic, the harder the Bourbons try to maintain control of the territories, the more they anger the locals. So it's like a no-win situation.
Middle management isn't happy.
What's that?
Middle management isn't
Oh, not at all. No, that's exactly what it is.
So the Churrigueresco,
Uh-huh.
that's more of the Habsburg, that's what they brought.
No, it's the Bourbons. Yeah, the Bourbons introduced it in the early 18th century.
And then they made it classical.
Yeah, later in the 18th century, as the style changes in Spain, the neoclassical replaces, you know, the Rococo. In the Spanish territories, it's Churrigueresco. It's like the Hispanic version or Spanish version of the Rococo. The styles change. So Spain's keeping up with this, but there's like a lag, you know, in the Americas. Plus, people have gotten invested in this particular visual language. So then when they start to introduce the neoclassical, especially once the academy is founded, they forcefully start destroying churches that are part of people's lives and removing altarpieces and repainting paintings, you know, removing all these Baroque flourishes and making them just gray. You know, people get upset. People are upset. So San Carlos, let's say 1785. It's a process of getting permission, petitioning and getting permission. By 1785, oh, thank you. So the academy is established around 1785. The official academy building is built in 1791. Before that, the classes are held in the Mint installation. Then we start to see the academic professors being commissioned to produce neoclassical monuments and to redo the architecture and design new neoclassical buildings, which requires, given the state of the city, that some things get torn down or altered. In the 1790s, yeah, 1790s into the early 1800s.
So the academy was founded as a neoclassical academy, not
Yeah, yeah. It was founded at the time of when neoclassicism was dominant. So the academy, in addition, by implementing sort of a neoclassical vocabulary or introducing it, the idea was to modernize sort of the American territories, because the Baroque or Churrigueresco was seen as outdated, as vulgar, as poor taste. Actually, when you look at colonial documents, you don't see the word neoclassicism. Of course, what you see is the word buen gusto, good taste. Whenever you see the word good taste, it means neoclassicism. There's an excellent volume that one of my PhD students, along with one of my mentors, co-edited on Buen Gusto and Classicism. If any of you are interested. I mean, after we're done, if you have any questions about sources, I can give you some sources. But there's an excellent edited volume that my former student and one of my mentors co-edited dealing with Buen Gusto and the classical language that's implemented in the late colonial period. All right, so then we get to Ferdinand VII, and I mean, he's not a very good ruler, and it's during his reign that Spain loses Mexico. Okay, so that's always like a sort of a tainted, his legacy, that he was seen as inept and losing. It's like the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire. What we see happening throughout, starting in the 17th century into the 18th century, is that imperial power shifts in Europe from Southern Europe to Northern Europe. England kind of takes over now as the new international power. The new international empire, which produces some interesting effects. Going back to your question of why this material is kind of marginalized and not looked at, when we see imperial power shift from Southern Europe to Northern Europe, I also kind of talk about the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, because that plays a very important role in this. We begin to see, as this power shifts and Britain comes into view as the new power, that these earlier sort of achievements and events that were headed by Hispanic Catholics kind of get erased from our historical memory. The focus is on the Anglo-centric world, and the Hispano-centric world kind of gets marginalized. I mean, Spain's always been marginal in Europe because of its Muslim heritage and Jewish presence. It doesn't follow the same historical trajectory than the rest of Western Europe, which considers itself to be Christian and white. Spain, because of its very interesting history, kind of has been relegated to the margins. So if you think about Spain being relegated to the margins, imagine its American territories that are even further removed. They're like multiple marginalities, okay? But our historical imagination, the US, even though its population is heteroglot and very diverse, the master narrative is tied to Protestants. And it's an Anglo-centric historical imaginary that we all work with. And in that imaginary, there's a very certain kind of narrative, very specific kinds of things we look at that kind of leave out these Indo-Hispanic sort of contributions or presences. And there have been different points in US history where these different ideologies kind of clash, especially as Northern European immigrants and settlers moved west and started to collide with what used to be the northern provinces of New Spain. With the Indo-Hispanic communities that were already there are a number of interesting things that happen that really bring to light these very different ways of thinking and doing things and seeing the world. There is a very distinct difference between Protestant and Catholic relationships to art and material culture that you really see in places like New Mexico. There are things in the Catholic context, for instance, religious images, the material is not important. So you have images that are covered in soot, and they don't clean them, because it's unnecessary. Or if something wears down, they'll just throw it away and replace it with a new image. And then you have Protestants coming into New Mexico, and they're like, why are they throwing this away? It's old. They pick it up and clean it. It's a very different idea of the value of material culture. It's just one example of many, many others that really illustrate sort of very different worldviews. So I actually want to teach a course at some point on the legacy of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation and how it continues to inform our politics today. Some of us might be old enough to remember when Kennedy was elected. It's like Catholic. Whoa, that was a big deal. I mean, and then also these anti-immigrant attitudes, which are, in my opinion, racist on one hand, but I think there's also this anti-Catholic kind of sentiment. I see this a lot in popular culture where Catholicism becomes the butt of jokes or ridicule, like the Virgin and the tortilla, or this kind of superstitious mysticism, and that's coming from like a Protestant. There's a legacy at work here that continues to shape our contemporary experience. And all of these things work together to, in part, inform why material associated with certain demographics are sort of seen as less important or lesser quality, et cetera, et cetera. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So just some portraits. We're clearly in a different period. We don't see those collars anymore and the black outfits. We're clearly in a different period given the French fashions at the time. This is Philip V, who was actually a good leader. Ferdinand, the Scholar King, Charles III. It was during the reign of Charles III, starting in 1759, that the Bourbon reforms really take hold. When he comes into power, he aggressively implements the reforms. Okay? So it's really during his reign that he starts pushing all these changes. And this is sort of the beginning of the disaffection of the local population. It's really during his reign that people really start to react to the disruptive effects of the Bourbon reforms that he's aggressively pushing. So he's an important figure, specifically because of his role in implementing the Bourbon reforms in a way that his predecessors had not. And it's his implementation of Bourbon reforms that really begins to upset the local population. And it's really from this point forward, from the middle of the 18th century to the end, that's when you begin to see sort of this interest in independence grow. Because it's also during this period that the American Revolution occurs. And then there's the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution. So revolution's in the air, you know, and this is inspiring locals in the Americas, and the Spanish Bourbon monarchy knows this. And they're very paranoid. You know, they don't want to lose, you know, their American territories. But it's really under his reign that all this begins to take shape because of his implementation of these aggressive policies. And Charles IV, an inept leader. There's a monument dedicated to him, a huge monument that was commissioned and produced by the Academy Professor of Sculpture, Manuel Tolsa, that's plopped in the middle of the main plaza of Mexico City, which causes a lot of problems because people hated him. And they construct this huge monument of this inept leader and put it right in front of the cathedral and the Viceregal Palace. And yeah, that upsets people. And that contributes, again, to further discord. And that sculpture, if you go to Mexico City, has anybody been to Mexico City? No? Okay, you really should go. Yeah, there are like over 100 museums, and you really, and the food and the culture and the history and the archaeology, it's just an amazing place. Don't be afraid, you won't get kidnapped. They have no interest, they kidnap rich Mexicans, okay? You know, you'll be fine, trust me, you'll be fine. You know, just don't ride the subway, take cabs, you know, especially as women, not recommended. But if you go to the National Museum of Art, which is near the downtown by the cathedral, the sculpture, it didn't get destroyed, luckily. After independence, they threw a cloth over it and hid it, you know, in the university. But then eventually they brought it back out, and it's now located in front of the National Museum. And it's quite a beautiful sculpture. It's an equestrian sculpture of him on horseback that has a very long history in Western art history. So, I mean, what's interesting is that Spain really saw itself as an heir to the Roman Empire. And there's actually an edited volume that was just published based on papers given at the Getty a few years ago that looks at that very issue, how Spain saw itself as heir to the Roman Empire and how they implemented these classical kinds of ideas and models in their empire as it was forming during the Hapsburg period in the 16th century into the 17th and 18th. So you see a lot of these classical quotations during the colonial period. It's a really interesting edited volume. If you're interested, I can tell you more. I just reviewed it for a journal. There's one bad essay, but the rest are good. And then Goya, this is where Goya comes in. You know, Charles IV, one of his sort of better known images was the portrait, of course, that most of us are familiar with, that he painted of Charles and his family. And then we have Ferdinand VII, who was in power, troubled leader who started losing Spain's territories, starting with Mexico.
He's got a huge chin too. Is he Hapsburg?
Yeah, they have Habsburg blood. You see the chin pop up among some of them.
They have the same intermingling.
Mm-hmm. No, the Bourbons did not intermarry. No, but the fact that they intermarried with the Habsburgs brought some of that messed up genetics into their own bloodline. And it pops up. Some of these Habsburg features sometimes pop up. And the Bourbons are still on the Spanish throne. You know, this is what one is. They're still there in Spain. And here's the map I was talking about that sort of outlines the different viceroyalties. So remember, during the 16th, 17th centuries, during the Habsburg period, there were only two. It was New Spain and all of Peru. And then under the Bourbons, they restructure. So this is where Peru gets broken down into Nueva Granada, what today is Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama. Then Peru is the central territory, right around Cusco and Lima. And then the southern part, they expand towards the coast, what today is Argentina. Buenos Aires is a colonial city. That becomes Rio de la Plata. And then there's like a little sliver here that's disconnected that's actually part of Peru. This continues to be part of Peru. Okay? So these are the main four viceroyalties that are in place by the end of the colonial period. Okay, so this is just kind of, again, repeating what I've been saying. So under the Habsburg period, two viceroyalties are established. New Spain, Peru. Capital cities for New Spain, it's Mexico City. For Peru, it's Lima. And I just noticed I forgot to write the cities for Nueva Granada. So for Nueva Granada, Bogotá. And then for Rio de la Plata, Buenos Aires. And again, just this is the Hapsburg period. This is the Bourbon period. Yeah, the Spanish, although we don't see it here, I mean, they had explored all the way up to the Carolinas, all the way along the East Coast. We know they went up the Mississippi to the Midwest. And what's fascinating about the 18th century is because when the Bourbons come into power, the Americas are very different than when the Habsburgs came into power 150 years earlier. When the Habsburgs came into the Spanish throne, Spain was the dominant European presence in the Americas. There was no competitive British or French presence around, so they were able to come in and just settle a huge amount of land. By the time that the Bourbons come into power in 1700, the English and the French are in the picture, and you have native populations in what is today Texas and New Mexico resisting sort of the Spanish presence. And one of the things that the Bourbon monarchy wants to do in the 18th century, because of the English and the French and the Comanches, especially the Comanches, were resisting the settlements that were being established in what today is Texas and New Mexico. The Bourbon monarchy was threatened by the Comanches, who were inhabiting territory they claimed, and they were threatened especially by the French coming in from the east. So in the 18th centuries, when we begin to see the increase of settlements up here, the Habsburgs didn't care about the northern areas. You know, they were concentrated in the central towards the south. When the Bourbons come into power, they see England and France coming into the picture. So they start a campaign to bring settlers up into New Mexico. They fortify those settlements. More missionaries come up to convert the population so they can function within this new social order. The thing is that Spain accomplished this with no real armies. The missionaries were their soldiers. You send the religious in to convert the natives, and so they can function. It changes their perception of themselves, of their relationship to the world, of their place in society, and it kind of processes them to function within a new social order that's being introduced. So it's really the religious missionaries that are the ones that make colonization possible. They're always the first ones to be sent into these frontiers to pacify. A lot of them get killed and are martyred, but they're the first arm. It's the missionaries that are the first arm of conquest. There's a really interesting movie that was made about 10 years ago, maybe 15, wow. It's called La Otra Conquista. It's a Mexican movie called The Other Conquest. La Otra Conquista. It has subtitles. It's a little artsy movie that focuses on not the physical conquest, but the spiritual conquest. Basically what it's saying is that it was the spiritual conquest that allows for colonization to occur. Okay, so La Otra Conquista, if you're interested, you can look it up. The Other Conquest. It's a really good movie that kind of focuses on what I'm saying now, that the role of the religious in the conquest and colonization effort. Here's the Viceroyalty of Spain, New Spain. This is where we're going to be focusing most of our attention, because 5 of the 6 objects are from Mexico City, kind of illustrating what I was saying earlier. And this is the Viceroyalty. These 3 different colored areas, the purple, the kind of yellowish, and the orange, are all part of New Spain. They're just separated because Guatemala becomes a captaincy general. The Bourbons change its status to what's called the captaincy general. So it kind of has its own governor, but it reports to Mexico City. And then the purple areas are the northern provinces that get settled during this period. Spain wants to fortify its presence, to resist sort of the encroachment of the French especially, but also the English, but then also to try to pacify the local natives that are resisting conversion and attacking the settlements. Okay, so Santa Fe. This map, it says here United States territory. This is, let's see, They're different dates. For the purple, it's United States territory by 1848. So that's what that is. The yellow, that's modern Mexico. The orange is declared independent, 1823. So these are like different dates. But this is like, I would say this is like 1750. Okay.